Please join me around the campfire, because tonight we are going to explore a world of gods, heroes, and monsters. In the forests, the fjords, and on the cold waters of northern seas, the time has come to tell you about Norse mythology. But let's begin immediately with the first story, and there will be many more. We will go back and forth, and I'll tell you about the history of the gods, the cosmology, the myth of creation, many different aspects of Norse mythology. This first story is about the king of gods, Odin, and how he lost an eye. Odin was the ruler of the Aesir tribe of the Aesir, an all-powerful clan that included Thor, Tyr, Loki, Balder or Heimdall, and many more. Their home was Asgard, one of the 9 worlds, and the highest of these 9 worlds, because all the worlds were located on the branches of the world tree, and Asgard was on the highest and sunniest branch. But Odin was not the kind of almighty warrior that ruled by pure physical strength like Thor. He was also an avid seeker of knowledge. He did not always play by the rules of honor or justice, and he was as much into poetry and the quest for wisdom as he was into triumphs on the battlefield. He often left Asgard to wander through the cosmos and pursue his own goals. His thirst for knowledge and for discovery was such that he was willing to sacrifice almost anything to it. And this is how he was able to discover the secret of the runes. At the center of the cosmos was the world tree, Yggdrasil, that supported the 9 worlds on its branches. Yggdrasil grew out of an infinitely deep pool, the Well of Erd, and the mysterious depth of the pool held many of the most powerful beings and forces of the cosmos, so mysterious and secret that they were unknown to the gods of Asgard themselves. Among these beings were 3 maidens, the Norns, who created the fates of all beings. They shaped fates by carving magical symbols, the runes, into Yggdrasil's trunk, and these intentions traveled throughout the tree by the power of these runes, reaching the worlds and individuals they were destined to. Everyone and everything in the 9 worlds, up to Asgard on top of the tree, was affected by the power of the Norns and their runes. From his throne, Odin observed the 3 maidens, and his will to appropriate their power and their wisdom only grew day after day. He became so obsessed that no sacrifice seemed too big to complete this task. But the runes did not reveal themselves to any but those who were worthy of seeing them, those who had proven their absence of fear. And Odin could not see them. He had to prove his worth. So he hung himself from a branch of Yggdrasil. He pierced himself with his spear And from this terribly precarious position, he scanned the dark waters below him. He had forbidden any other god to help him, because this would have invalidated his attempt at showing he was willing to sacrifice himself, and that he feared nothing on his quest to discover the runes. He stared and stared into the waters, staying on the edge that separates the living from the dead. After one day, he still hadn't seen the runes. Another day passed, then several more, and the runes still refused to reveal themselves. But at the end of the 9th day, as his last forces were vanishing without bending his will, he began to perceive shapes in the depth of the pool. The runes had finally accepted the proof of his fearlessness. They had accepted his sacrifice, and they began to show themselves to him. They did not only reveal their shapes, they also let him see and learn the secrets that lied within them, beyond their physical form. Odin quickly fixed this new knowledge in his memory that knew no limit, and ended his ordeal by climbing on the rope he had used to hang himself. He could then return to Asgard and heal his wounds. Odin had now acquired the power of the runes, which turned him into one of the mightiest beings in the universe. And he liked that, because his thirst for power was as great as his curiosity for knowledge. Armed with the knowledge of the runes, he could now protect himself and his friends in battles. He could wake the dead. He could render his enemies' weapons useless, magically put out fires, or heal any wound, physical or emotional. Odin was satisfied, but he never had enough. And on another occasion, he proved again his willingness to sacrifice himself to acquire knowledge. At the base of Yggdrasil, amongst the roots of the World Tree, lived an exceptionally wise being called Mimir, who sometimes advised the gods. Mimir's knowledge of all things was unmatched, including by Odin himself, and he achieved this extraordinary understanding of everything by drinking water from a well. The water came from the Well of Erd, the same pool from which Yggdrasil grew, and where Odin had seen the runes for the first time. So this water was not ordinary. It contained all cosmic knowledge, and this knowledge could be absorbed by those who drank it. Odin climbed down the tree, all the way down from Asgard to the roots, with the intention of asking Mimir for a drink from this miraculous water. But Mimir knew the value of even a few droplets of this sacred water, and he refused, unless Odin accepted to sacrifice one of his eyes in return. It was one thing to risk his life to discover the runes, but the certainty of losing one eye against the mere promise of extended knowledge was yet another commitment. But Odin cared more about acquiring knowledge than his physical integrity, and he opted to accept the sacrifice. He took one of his eyes out and dropped it into the well. Mimir kept his promise. He dipped a horn into the well and offered Odin a drink of his water. From this moment on, Odin became the one-eyed god. He didn't lose his eye on a battlefield or a heroic fight against a monster, like some people would think for a god of war. He sacrificed it to acquire something much more precious than honor or respect in his view, wisdom and knowledge. As you know, mythological tales are always open to interpretation. And there can be many because they often exist in several different versions with alterations. Apart from the simple pleasure of storytelling or their religious significance, myths always serve as a reference in the cultures where they appear. They can be cautionary tales, explanations about the origins of the world, or why it is as it is. They also have a political dimension. But one problem with Norse mythology is that there is not an abundance of documents, of texts to refer to, contrary to other ancient cultures like China, India, ancient Egypt, or Greece. In contrast, Norse mythology is known mainly through medieval texts. The most important ones are called the Eddas. We will return to them later. And apart from texts, there are remains of oral traditions and archaeology. And all the important texts are from the last generations, when Scandinavia and Iceland were in the process of being converted to Christianity, and the old religion, the old cosmology, and all the beliefs that came with it were in the process of disappearing. The texts are from these last generations or even after the massive conversion to Christianity. But before we take a look at these sources and their historical significance and the people who developed this myth, a branch of Germanic peoples, the Vikings, I'm going to tell you about these 9 worlds that were said to be supported by Yggdrasil, the world tree. There's a lot to tell, a lot of things to discuss. So before we begin our exploration of the 9 worlds, make yourself comfortable. You know that apart from YouTube, you can listen to many of my stories on Slumber, the sleep and relaxation app. They sponsor tonight's story that will be available on the app with hundreds more bedtime stories, guided meditations or ambient soundtracks to help you fall asleep or pleasantly accompany you during daytime. They have many different narrators, male and female. It is very easy to use, and a prominent feature of the app, in my view, is the possibility to customize any story you listen to. You can add all sorts of background sounds, modulate them, or combine them in a few seconds, literally. I usually don't add background music or sound effects over my voice here, so if you would like to try it simply, this can be an option for you. You can try the app for free. We have agreed on a free trial of 1 month for my subscribers instead of the usual 7 days. It is non-binding, so that you can have time to decide if it works for you. The app works for Android and iOS. You can benefit from the extended free trial by clicking on the link in the video description or in the first comment pinned under the video. Really dive into the exploration of the 9 worlds. I already told you about Asgard, the land of the Aesir gods. There were other gods too, the Vanir, and they once were at war with the Aesir. This will be another story for later. These 9 worlds were not easy to travel to by any means. They were generally invisible, and only secret doors led to them. Only the world of humanity, Midgard, was visible, but the 8 other worlds could at times connect with the visible world. For example, Jotunheim, the world of the giants, could overlap with the wilderness in our world, or Hel, the underworld, could connect with graves, or Asgard with the sky. The number 9 came back a lot in Norse mythology, as well as other Germanic peoples' myths which were closely apparented. It is unknown exactly why. It could be that the lunar calendar had 27 days, a multiple of 9, but there is no final explanation to their fascination for this number. The positions of the worlds shown at different levels around the trunk of the world tree are also speculative. These are modern depictions, because nothing in the sources show these 9 worlds physically placed around a giant tree on branches. It could have been a metaphor or a symbol, because it doesn't really fit with the existence of overlaps between them. When accounts locate Asgard in the sky, this is probably more spiritual or symbolic than physical. Asgard is first and foremost the land, the enclosure of the Aesir gods, the most famous and probably the most important deities for the Vikings in their daily lives. They were the ones praised as models and worshipped for all sorts of favors. Asgard was almost always presented as a model of order and civilization. Ancient Germanic peoples had the concepts of Innangard and Utangard. What was Innangard, literally inside the fence, was orderly and law-abiding, stable. What was Utangard, outside or beyond the fence, was wild and chaotic. These concepts applied not only to geography or to these mythical worlds, it also applied to the psyche, to thoughts, to actions. They could be either Innangard and well thought out, rational and justified, or Utangard, disorderly and anarchic. Asgard was the representation of the Innangard, a model of orderly perfection. Another world, Jotunheim, the homeland of the giants, was the exact opposite, a model of Utangard with its chaos and unpredictability. And between the two, somewhere in the middle with elements of both law and civilization, but also chaos and wilderness, stood our world, Midgard, the middle enclosure, or middle land. Before we talk about Midgard, here is a story about how Asgard was fortified. There was a time when the palace of the Aesir gods in Asgard was defenseless, and this was a concern for Odin. One day, a certain smith arrived at Asgard and offered to build the gods a high wall that would protect them against even formidable enemies. The smith said that he could complete the task rapidly, in only 3 seasons. But he also understood that the gods had no alternative if they wanted their wall. So he asked for an exorbitant price. He would build the wall against the hand of the delightful goddess Freya, the goddess of love and beauty, plus the sun and the moon. It was certainly in Odin's power to grant the three, but was it worth it? The gods took counsel. From the start, Freya was against these terms, as her fate was at stake. But the other gods really wanted their wall, and thought that there would always be time to rediscuss the terms later. One of them, Loki, came up with a plan. He suggested the builder should be granted what he wished, but only if he could complete his work in a single winter instead of 3 seasons, with no help from anyone but his horse. The gods didn't really want to grant him the sun or the moon, and even less Freya's hand, but they found the plan perfect, because there was no way the smith could build a wall so fast. So he would fail to deliver it so quickly, and they wouldn't have to pay him anything. To their satisfaction, the builder agreed to the new terms, on the condition that all the gods swore oath to keep their promise. And so it was done. The builder began working on the wall. At first, the gods marveled at how fast the wall was rising, and how thick it was. The horse hauled enormous boulders over huge distances, night and day, and the builder piled them up so precisely and strongly that this wall would certainly be able to discourage any enemy. But as the winter progressed, their marvel turned to concern, and then alarm. The wall was closer to be complete every day, and at this pace, the builder would be able to claim his prize. When the end of the winter was only 3 days ahead, only the stones around the gate had yet to be put in place. The builder would most probably succeed. The gods' fear and anger at being so close to being tricked turned against Loki, the instigator of the plan. They threatened him, said he would be responsible for the loss of the sun and the moon, which would plunge the 9 worlds into darkness, and for the horrible fate of the delightful Freya, who would have to marry the builder and agree to his disgusting demands. Loki pleaded with the gods to spare his life and promised to find a solution. Loki was never short of ideas and tricks, so he came up with another plan. The following night, he took the appearance of a mare, and when the horse went for more stones, as usual, he showed himself as the mare. The horse was aroused by this welcome distraction, and instantly forgot to collect the stones. Instead, it ran after Loki in disguise. Loki, as the mare, ran all night, and all night the builder's horse tried to catch him. When morning came, the horse was still missing, and the builder understood that without stones, he would now be unable to finish the wall in time. The gods were delighted to see how Loki had reversed the situation, but it didn't make them gracious. Their anger of almost having been played turned against the builder. instead of wages for his work, they deemed justified a punishment for the builder who had almost earned the sun, the moon, and Freya's hand. Thor gave him a fatal blow from his hammer, and the builder was no more. But the gods were not the only winners here, because far from the wall, in the forest, the horse had finally caught up with the mare, and could finally achieve his goals with poor Loki. Of this unexpected union, an 8-legged horse soon saw the light of day, the horse Sleipnir, that would become Odin's mount. Now, let's resume our exploration of the 9 worlds and talk about Midgard. Midgard was created by the gods. They slew a giant called Ymir, and they created the various parts of the world from its body parts, including a fence that they made from Ymir's eyebrows. It sounds rather bizarre, and in fact, in many Norse myths, the proportions are quite surprising. They didn't have a monopoly on this. For example, in Greek mythology, one anecdote was that all the stars we see at night, the entire Milky Way, was actually breast milk spilled by goddess Hera when she fed the young Hercules. It didn't sound very realistic either, and we will see later with the Norse myth of creation that it was not at all about realism or accurate proportions. This didn't really matter because, as myth, they were a kind of poetry, and they had metaphorical functions or symbolic functions. Realism was not the point. Also, the vision that the Vikings had of their world and their society was quite far from the Western European perception of them in the Middle Ages. They were seen as uncivilized warriors and looters. The ancestors of the Vikings had stayed at a distance from the Roman Empire. There was a mutual awareness, but Scandinavia was way too far for the Romans to think about conquest, and they already had a hard time containing the Germans. Also, the Vikings were never a single kingdom. They were a collection of tribes, clans, and smaller kingdoms, forming an ethnic and cultural area in what is now Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Iceland. When they really made an entrance on the European scene in the 8th century, it was indeed to make raids and attack without warning any town or monastery or ship they could loot. So in Western European chronicles and later historiography, they were depicted as barbarians, violent and uncivilized. All the more that they were pagans, and the regions they attacked had been Christianized. But the Vikings were not just warriors, they were also traders, explorers. They went on to explore well beyond Western Europe. The ones from Sweden looked towards Russia, and they went all the way south to the Byzantine Empire. They crossed the Atlantic. They reached North Africa in raids. They obviously practiced agriculture, and their society had all the characteristics of civilization. It had an order, sedentary settlements, an elaborate society with rules, traditions, laws. They were not inherently chaotic, far from that. And the myth of Midgard, as this intermediate world populated by humans, reflects this perception of humanity and their society. Midgard was located between the opposite poles of order and chaos, but protected by the gods and invited to get more civilized, more orderly. This shows their conscience or their understanding that the model to tend to for human societies was one of order and stability like Asgard, not the wilderness and chaos epitomized by Jotunheim, even though these aspects were also part of our imperfect world. So Jotunheim was a third world under or around Midgard. This was not explicit, and it was described as an inhospitable expanse covered in dark forests and mountain peaks, gripped in a never-ending winter that only wild beasts populated. But Jotunheim was also the dwelling of the giants. Giant is a translation of the term Jotun, and one that can be misleading, because giant in English evokes a being of enormous size. This was not what a Jotun was. The Old Norse word Jotun comes from Proto-Germanic, and it means devourer. So to the ancient Norse, there was no notion of a huge size in the term Jotun, but like the Titans of Greek mythology, the giants of Norse mythology were powerful creatures, enemies of the gods. You remember I told you about these concepts of Inangard, what is orderly and law-abiding, and Utangard, what is chaotic and wild. The giants are the personification of the Utangard. The Aesir gods from Asgard were the protectors of civilization, and despite their personalities and personal flaws, which were real, they tried to elevate humans, make their societies more prosperous, more orderly, more cultured. The Devourers did the opposite. They were constantly trying to drag humans back to primordial chaos. They were forces of destruction or of decay. The opposition between Aesir gods and giants, or Jotnir, Jotun in the plural, is not really good versus evil. It is rather order versus chaos, or civilized versus wild. This is a big difference between ancient pantheons and later monotheist religions or traditions. In monotheist religions, the single God is almighty, knows everything, created the world and its inhabitants, and is literally perfection. God is perfectly good. On the opposite, the devil is a representation or an incarnation of evil. Gods from ancient pantheons were not that powerful, and they were never perfect. They were not the creators of the cosmos either. They had been created with it, and even though they were eternal and incomparably more powerful than humans, their power had limitations. They could not know everything. They had to fight. They made mistakes. They had distinct personalities, and sometimes even their rule was not eternal. We will see that later with Ragnarok at the end. Specifically in the Norse pantheon, the giants were not intrinsically evil. They just followed their destructive nature, and occasionally they could even play a useful role, even though inadvertently. The Aesir gods and the giants were not even entirely different creatures. Odin was half giant, and the gods didn't seek to destroy the giants, but rather to keep them in check, so that a balance would be preserved. So let's keep exploring the 9 worlds after these 3 ones: Asgard, Midgard, and Jotunheim. The 4th world was Vanaheim, the home of another tribe of deities, the Vanir. These gods are like a lost continent of Norse mythology, because the sources are very fragmentary, so we don't exactly know what their importance was to the Norse. Some of them may have been among the most widely worshipped across the Viking world, but to us they look eclipsed by Aesir gods. There is no known description of Vanaheim either. It is vaguely pictured as a place wilder than Asgard, where the forces of nature dominate, but it doesn't really inform us of the precise vision that the Norse had of this world. Among famous Vanir gods are 3 figures that are better known because they joined the Aesir in Asgard after a war between the 2 tribes. There was Njord, a god associated with wealth and seafaring, that seems to have been very well known and venerated by the Vikings. There was also his daughter, Freya. We talked about her in a previous story, and his son, Freyr. The 2 also became honorary members of the Aesir tribe. Freya was famous for her fondness of love, beauty, and fine material possessions. If we were to make comparisons with other pantheons, she would be the figure closer to Venus for the Romans and Aphrodite for the Greeks. It is widely believed that Freya and another goddess, Frigg, Odin's wife, were actually the same figure for most of Norse history. In later sources from the Middle Ages, they are distinguished with 2 different goddesses, but they share so many similarities that it could just be a misunderstanding by the authors who put Norse mythology in writing after the Christianization of Scandinavia, because their storylines and personalities seem similar enough to consider them the same deity. The 3rd Vanir to join the Aesir was Freya's brother, Freyr. Yet another divinity that was widely venerated and well liked, because he was associated with peace, good health, and fertility, both agricultural for harvests and sexual. His blessing was called on weddings and in the celebration of harvests. But why did Njord and his 2 children end up in Asgard and became honorary Aesir gods? Because they were taken as hostages after a war. And this is another story I have to tell you. The war between the Aesir and the Vanir. When our story began, Freya was still living with her tribe, the Vanir, and she was the most powerful practitioner of magic in the entire 9 worlds. She practiced Seder, a form of magic that gave her the power to discern the course of fate, and also to work on the structure of fate to bring about change. In other words, Freya could interfere in destinies, and her services were passionately sought after. So she traveled from town to town and from world to world, where people would hire her for her craft. She eventually visited Asgard, the home of the Aesir. The Aesir gods were impressed with her talent and sought her services. So much so that soon it became almost an obsession for them. Their selfish desires that they wished to fulfill with the help of the magician were becoming more important than anything else. And the rules of honor, loyalty, and obedience to the law that characterized the Aesir were pushed aside. Realizing that, they didn't blame themselves for their own shortcomings. This was not their way of dealing with problems. They blamed Freya. They conspired to murder her and return to their previous life once she would have disappeared. 3 times they tried to burn her, but she was a powerful goddess too, and 3 times she was reborn from the ashes. When the Vanir learned what had been done, or at least attempted, against one of their own, they became hostile to the Aesir, and soon the hostility between the 2 tribes erupted into war. They began fighting. The Aesir with physical strength and the rules of combat, the Vanir through magic, which was their way. The war remained indecisive for a long time. Each side gained the upper hand in turns, but neither the magic of the Vanir nor the strength of Thor or the tricks of Odin and Loki could put an end to it. Eventually, the 2 tribes had enough of this fighting and agreed to call a truce. This is when they exchanged hostages that would live with the other tribe as a guarantee of peace, as was customary between tribes that had been at war. Njord and his children, Freya and Freyr, joined the Aesir. The Vanir welcomed 2 members of the Aesir, Ymir, a god of great strength that presided over frenzy on the battlefields, but of limited intelligence. He was often at a loss for words. And Mimir, the same Mimir who had gained incomparable wisdom thanks to the magic water, and that Odin had visited and offered an eye to, in order to broaden his knowledge in our first story. The Vanir were well versed into the magic arts, but it didn't mean they were that smart. They observed that Ymir was able to give advice of extraordinary wisdom and value, and they began to regularly ask for his insight on everything. What they didn't realize was that Ymir was visionary and articulate only in the presence of Mimir, who was the real source of wisdom. As time passed, they kept asking Ymir for advice on any problem. But as he was not always in the company of Mimir, he also gave pointless and unhelpful answers. The Vanir grew angry at his stupidity and felt cheated in the exchange of hostages. So, as retribution, they beheaded Mimir, the very source of wisdom they could have used to their advantage, and they sent his head back to Asgard. Odin was quite sad of the loss of his old friend, but this didn't restart the war. Instead, Odin embalmed the head and revived it with magic spells, so that the preserved head of Mimir would continue to give him advice in times of need. Now let's resume our exploration of the 9 worlds with the 5th and the 6th ones. Niflheim, the world of fog, ice and darkness, and Muspelheim, the world of fire and heat. These 2 were cosmological opposites, and they played an important role in the creation of our world and all living beings. this is yet another story, the birth of the giant Ymir, the ancestor to all the giants and also the gods. How did it all begin? Before there was any living creature, or even plants, soil or sky, there was only a gaping abyss, an expanse of darkness and void that existed between Niflheim, the homeland of ice, and Muspelheim, the homeland of fire. This lasted eons, that no one existed to record. But it happened that frost from Niflheim and flames from Muspelheim crept towards each other and met in the middle of the abyss. The meeting of these elemental principles set the creation of the world in motion. The fire melted the ice, and the drops formed themselves into Ymir, the first giant. Ymir was a gigantic creature and was hermaphrodite. It could reproduce without anyone else. When he slept in the void of the abyss that now had its first resident, other giants appeared, all born from Ymir's body. As the frost continued to melt, a second creature was born from the drops, a cow. She nourished Ymir with her milk, and nourished herself by licking the ice that contained salt. Her licks slowly uncovered another creature that was prisoner of the ice, Buri, Odin's grandfather, and the first of the Aesir gods. Buri had a son, who married a female giant, a daughter of Ymir, the primordial giant, and together they had 3 children, Odin and his 2 brothers, all half-giant and half-god. Odin and his brothers slew Ymir, and from his corpse they constructed the world. They formed oceans from his blood, soil from his skin, vegetation from his hair, the sky from his skull. And on this new world, the first spring began. Some time later, the gods formed the first man and the first woman from tree trunks, and humanity began to multiply. But many giants had appeared from Ymir's body before the first giant died. Giants had multiplied, and their chaotic nature threatened to destroy this new world, Midgard. So in order to protect it, the gods built a fence around it, using Ymir's eyebrows, so that this new world would thrive, at least for now, because everything that begins needs to end, and the end of times would eventually happen. We will see that later. So we have seen 6 worlds at this point: Asgard, Midgard, Jotunheim, Vanaheim, Niflheim, and Muspelheim. There are 3 left. 2 others were home to extraordinary creatures: Alfheim, the world inhabited by the elves, demigod-like beings. The elves were luminous and described as more beautiful than the sun. There are no known descriptions of their homeland, but it can be imagined as full of light and beauty. Alfheim contrasted with Nidavellir, or Svartalfheim, the subterranean world of the dwarves, as much as the elves lived above ground, in luminous places. The dwarves were master smiths and master craftsmen, dwelling beneath the ground, in a labyrinth of mines and forges. And finally, the ninth world, the underworld, was Hel or Helheim, the realm of the fierce goddess Hel that reigned on it. Hel was thought to be located underground, like graves, but the name and the location should not make us conclude that it was a place of torment, like the Christian concept of hell. The similarity in names is not a coincidence. Hel, H-E-L, and the modern English word hell have the same root in the Proto-Germanic language, which is an ancestor of Old Norse and Old English. The original meaning is believed to have meant hidden or concealed, and it was used to qualify the underworld. It is likely that when Christian missionaries spread Christianity to the Anglo-Saxons, they used the closest word they could find in Old English to refer to Satan's realm, and the same term came to name the Christian hell in English. But apart from the similarity in name, and the fact that it could be located underground in both traditions, the two concepts are very different. In Norse religion, hell was not a world where people ended up after death as a form of punishment. It was generally cast in neutral terms, as a place where people kept living on the other side of death, doing the same kind of things, eating, drinking, sleeping, fighting. All these worlds, their functions, their locations, or their history, appear in the various sources that give us access to Norse mythology. But the sources may be conflicting. They came from different places and periods. Like all mythology, Norse mythology was not set in stone, and it evolved over time. So what are the sources we have at our disposal? There are several, and the most complete and central to our modern knowledge are texts from Iceland called the Eddas. First, there is a collection of poems known as the Poetic Edda that is incomparably precious because they expose the Old Norse cosmology and mythology in a systematic way. The authors are unknown and the period uncertain, but they were composed sometime between the 10th and 13th centuries, at the time when Scandinavia and Iceland were being Christianized, but Old Norse beliefs still circulated and resisted the religious shift. There is also a treatise called the Prose Edda from the 13th century by an Icelandic scholar, Snorri Sturluson. It is also a rich source of information, but it is post-Christian, and experts believe that many interpretations and tales from the Prose Edda bear the trace of the new world that had begun. Also from Iceland in the Middle Ages are several historical texts called the sagas. They may contain real elements, but they are not historical in the modern sense. They mix real events with legends and mythological references, so they also are a source. On top of these documents, there are also medieval compilations of mythological stories from Denmark, from Germany, like the Nibelungenlied, and sometimes Old Anglo-Saxon literature helps corroborate other sources. For example, Beowulf, the epic poem, is a valuable source here. Apart from writings, archaeology is an important non-literary source. Of course, archaeological finds do not tell the stories by themselves, but they corroborate texts with the iconography or the ancient naming of places. I already told you about several gods of the Norse pantheon: Odin, his wife Freya or Frigg, her brother Freyr. So now let's look at some other prominent Norse gods. Only a few ones, because there are actually dozens of characters and many tales I could tell you about in another story, or two or three, because I had to leave aside a lot of possible stories for tonight. So obviously you know about another famous Norse god called Thor. Thor was the archetype of the warrior god, the ideal toward which human warriors should aspire, courageous, with a strong sense of duty, and very powerful, even more with his magic belt of strength and his hammer. In many episodes, he fights the Jotnar, the giants, defends Asgard, and protects humanity. He also fights monsters, especially an enormous sea serpent called Jormungand, so big that it encircles Midgard. Ironically, Thor was the ultimate protection against the Jotun, but he was 3/4 Jotun himself. His father, Odin, was half Jotun, as we saw before, and his mother was of full giant ancestry. Another prominent god is Loki, and Loki was a very ambivalent figure. His father was a giant, not a god, and he was more than anything known for his tricks and a lack of concern for the well-being of other gods. He was unreliable and often painted as a villain, with no consideration for social expectations or his reputation. He was also a coward, focused on self-preservation, and even when he was useful, because several times he saved the day, as we have seen in the story about the wall of Asgard, it was always because he was forced to. Even what we could call the laws of nature didn't apply to him. He fathered monsters, such as the giant serpent Jormungand, the enemy of Thor, and turned into a mother when he shapeshifted into a mare. At the end of times, Ragnarok, that I kept for the end of the story, he turned against the gods and sided with the giants. So, in a sense, he is a god because he resides in Asgard and interacts with them. He has formidable powers, but he also embodied the opposite to traditional Norse values like honor, honesty, and courage, and no traces of any kind of worship of Loki has ever been found in historical records. People who lived on the margin of society, acted as tricksters or saw themselves as smarter than average, would have claimed the patronage of Odin, not Loki, because it was not desirable at all. There were more figures: Balder, a handsome and cheerful god who was loved by all creatures, a kind of northern Apollo. Heimdall, the god tasked with guarding the god's stronghold in Asgard. His dwelling sat on top of a rainbow bridge that led to Asgard, the Bifrost. Tyr, another war god that presided over matters of law and justice, and many more with an obscure role because we lack sources, like Idun, Bragi, Sif. prominent giants were also famous. Different tales give names and information about some of them. But as I said earlier, this colorful world, full of mysteries, magic, creatures embodying all concepts or feelings imaginable, this world that was born from the meeting of fire and ice at the dawn of times, was doomed to disappear. It is now time for the last story of the night, the story of Ragnarok. Ragnarok, in Old Norse it meant fate of the gods, was the destruction of the cosmos and everything in it, including the gods, the giants, the different worlds and their inhabitants. Was or will be, because Ragnarok is the last possible tale of Norse mythology. But to the Vikings it was a prophecy, a disaster waiting to happen, even though the precise story of this cataclysmic destruction was already written. So I'll tell it in the future tense. You remember the Norns we discovered at the beginning, the three maidens who decided the fates of gods and humans. One day, they will decree that a great winter shall come. The light and warmth of the sun will fade, plunging the world into darkness and a cold like no living creature has ever experienced. Around the world, biting winds and snowstorms will add to the devastation. This terrible winter shall last for the equivalent of 3 winters, without respite, and during this very long month, plants will die, harvests will be lost, and animals in the forests and the seas will die in large numbers, making food harder and harder to find. Mankind will be so desperate that all laws and codes of conduct will collapse, leaving only a cruel and hopeless struggle for survival. It will be an age of wars, when tribes will explode, brothers will slay their brothers, and fathers will slay their sons. In the skies, the sun and the moon will fully disappear, and so will the stars, leaving only a black void above the heads of the survivors. Monsters will get free or awaken, such as a monstrous wolf called Fenrir, or Jormungand, the giant serpent. Waters from the oceans will be spilled over the land by the convulsions of the serpent, and floating on these floods, a sinister ship will travel with an army of giants, led by no other than Loki, the traitor god. The dome of the sky, made millennia ago from the skull of the primordial giant Ymir, will be split, and from the crack, fire giants from Muspelheim will emerge. These fire giants will attack Asgard, marching across the Bifrost, the rainbow that connects Asgard to Midgard, and the Bifrost will collapse behind them. Heimdall, the guardian, will blow his horn to announce the arrival of the moment all gods have feared for their entire existence. The gods will know in advance that everything is lost, and that this battle shall be their last. But when everything is lost, honor can still be saved, so they will decide to go to battle against the giants and the monsters. Odin will be joined by the champions of men, an army of heroes chosen by him over the centuries for their bravery and strength. And together they will confront the giant wolf, Fenrir. They will collectively fight more valiantly than any god or any man ever fought, but they will lose and be swallowed by Fenrir. The only survivor, one of Odin's sons, burning with rage, will be able to avenge his father and kill the wolf. Other duels will also end in the death of both sides. The god Tyr will slay another monstrous wolf, but be killed by it. Heimdall will face Loki, and both will fall. So will Freya and the chief of the fire giants, and Thor and the serpent Jormungand, leaving no survivors on the battlefield. Then, when the last god and the last Jotun will have expired, the remains of the world will sink into the sea. The waters will cover everything, and the waters themselves will dissipate, leaving only a void. Creation and all that had occurred since will be completely undone, as if nothing had happened. Was it all just a dream, after all? Maybe, according to some, another world will arise. Maybe the waters will not disappear but recede, and another world will be repopulated by a few survivors. Or, one day, if the void replaces everything, maybe the frost from Niflheim and the flames from Muspelheim will meet, and everything shall start again. We have reached the end of our stories for tonight. I will now leave you around the campfire and in the company of the sounds from the forest. Everything is perfectly peaceful, and they will lull you to sleep. Or if you don't feel sleepy, you can pick another story from my library. I will put the one about the ring of the Nibelung in the description. Thank you for joining me, and I'll be back soon for another story. Sweet dreams.